A Game of Thrones, the board game, is a strategic game of military conquest and control set in the world of George R.R. Martin's hugely popular Song of Ice and Fire fantasy series.
In a Game of Thrones, players take on the role of one of the major houses of Westeros, and they are vying for control of the area. This can accommodate 3 to 6 players and plays out in 2 to 3 hours. This version of the game doesn't have any expansions. However, it does incorporate some elements from the Storm of Swords and Clash of Kings expansion from the first edition.
So at the start of Game of Thrones, players choose which of the available houses they're going to play, and then receive their player screen, their army units, their tokens, and their house cards. Then they get to place their starting units on the board, along with the appropriate number of neutral force markers. The Wildling and the Westeros decks are shuffled and placed to the side of the board, and then the tokens on the Wildling threat and turn counter tracks are placed at the beginning.
So the game plays out in 10 rounds. At the end of those 10 rounds, the player that controls the most regions that have a castle or a stronghold wins the game. If at any point during the game, any one player controls 7 of those regions, then they win the game immediately.
So each round of A Game of Thrones plays out in 3 phases: the Westeros phase, the planning phase, and the action phase. During the Westeros phase, players turn over and resolve the Westeros cards, which are going to have either a global effect on the game or are going to force players to change their positions on the various tracks.
So during this phase, the top card of each of the 3 Westeros decks is turned over, and the amount of Wildling icons on each of those cards is counted up. The Wildling token is advanced down its track that many spaces. If the Wildling token gets to the end of that track, then the Wildlings attack, and all of the houses of Westeros have to band together to defend it from the Wildlings. Once the power tokens are added up, if the defenders win against the Wildlings, then the player that gave the most power tokens to the defense of Westeros gets the reward listed on the top card of the Wildling deck. If, however, the Wildlings win, then all of the players suffer the consequences listed on that card.
After dealing with the Wildlings, the players finish the Westeros phase by resolving the 3 Westeros cards in order. The mustering card allows players to recruit new units at their castles and strongholds, although the size of the armies they can build, as well as the total number of armies they can have, is governed by their position on the supply track.
This phase can also see players secretly bidding to change their positions on the 3 tracks: the Iron Throne track, the Fiefdoms track, and the King's Court track. The Iron Throne track determines turn order. The player at the top of the Iron Throne track determines the outcome of any ties within the game that are not combat-related. The Fiefdoms track determines the outcome of any combat-related ties within the game. The King's Court track determines the amount of special order tokens each player gets within the game. The player at the top of the King's Court track gets the Messenger Raven.
During the planning phase of A Game of Thrones, players secretly assign orders to the units on their board, and then they reveal them simultaneously. Players place their order tokens in any areas on the board that contain 1 or more of their units. These orders are all given simultaneously, and each player can only place 1 order per area. Each player can give a total number of orders equal to the number of tokens that they possess, plus any special order tokens that have been granted to them by the King's Court track.
So all of these orders are resolved during the action phase, beginning with the raid orders, then the march orders, then the consolidate power orders. So for raid orders, these proceed one at a time in the order of the Iron Throne track. So when you're raiding, you choose an area, a region that's adjacent to your raid token, which has an order in it that belongs to another player. You then remove your raid token and that order token from that other player off the board, effectively canceling their order.
Next, the march orders are given and resolved, which usually leads to combat. A player can move all, some, or none of their units from the area that has been assigned the march order, and these units can be moved separately or together into an adjacent area.
If units are marched into an area with an opponent's units already there, then combat is going to happen. So how combat happens is we add up the combat score for each side. That includes the units that are there, defense orders, march orders, and support orders that apply. Then each player plays 1 house card from their hand, which will change the numbers, as well as potentially add different effects, like you could force your opponent to take casualties if they retreat. Then the player with the highest combat score is the victor, and the loser has to retreat out of that area, and their units are routed, which means that they are placed on their side, and their strength cannot be added to any other battles that round.
After all the march orders have been resolved, it's time to consolidate power. Players do this by removing a consolidate power token from the board and collecting a power token, plus extra ones for any crown-shaped power icon that's on that area of the map. Then any remaining support and defense orders are removed, routed units are restored, and a new round begins.
So I really love a Game of Thrones. I always have a lot of fun playing it. One of the big pros for this game is that you are working against each other, so it's a competitive game, but it has that really nice element of having to band together to fight against the wildlings, which adds a really nice change to the middle of the game. A con, however, it can be a little bit fiddly. There are a lot of tracks on the board, there are a lot of tokens, a lot of things to keep in mind when you're managing your armies, and sometimes you can lose track of a few things, and there are a lot of little pieces, which can turn people off.
Another con is that it is a long game, which a lot of people don't mind, but it's particularly prone to getting stalled by people who take a long time to make decisions because of all that secrecy during the planning phase. That being said, that planning phase is one of my favorite parts in the game because the secrecy of all the orders you're giving really ramps up the tension in the game and makes it a lot more interesting, especially for the military conquest. It also really helps fulfill the theme, which is really nicely executed in this. Not only is the art, especially on the cards, just gorgeous, but the way that you play the game really makes you feel like you're involved in the politics and the warfare of Westeros to a really powerful degree.